Hello, everybody, and welcome to Create Your Best Life with Rex. It's another episode. I'm your host, Rex Sykes, and it's so good to have you here today. I'm excited about my guest and the topic. The topic is Napoleon Hill, scholar or scammer. And the author, the researcher, is Jason Youngblood. He's the author of The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, scholar or scammer. He also has written some other books, How to Get Money for College as a High School Student, and Life is Easy, Life is Good, Living with an Ecstatic Love for Life. Now, you can find his books on Amazon and eBay. He lives in Columbus, Ohio with his wife, Dora. And I've got to say that I like to think that I'm up on everything Napoleon Hill, and sometimes I'm just not. It was J.B. Hill, Napoleon Hill's grandson, who said, "Oh, you should talk with Jason Youngblood." And I said, in a heartbeat when I found out about Jason. So I'm glad that he's here today. JB did a show with me a little while earlier, and we would have included Jason at the time, but it kind of came up at the last moment. But I'm thrilled to have Jason here today, and I'm going to bring him up now and say, "Hi, Jason. How you doing?"
Good. How are you, Rex?
Good. I have your book here. It's an amazing book.
Thank you.
And this is volume 1 of 4 volumes, correct?
Yes, there's 4 volumes.
And is that the complete set, or will there be more volumes?
No, just the 4 volumes. It's just extensive research, so I had to divide it up into the 4 volumes. But yeah, they can find that on Amazon and eBay as well too.
Well, let's talk about how you got started with all this. How did you get fascinated enough with Napoleon Hill to write 4 volumes of books about his history, about him?
All right, so I'll try to make this the short story. So back in 2015, I tried to read Think and Grow Rich. However, I just couldn't get into it for whatever reason. Fast forward to 2020, I'm selling cars at a Honda dealership, and the pandemic happens and we get laid off. So because we got laid off and there's social distancing, I sought a new career. So I inquired about a life insurance company that allowed you to sell life insurance over the phone or through telesales. And when I started the training with this life insurance company, instead of training me how to do life insurance or sell life insurance, they were training me about how to set a goal. And all through the training, they're mentioning names like Napoleon Hill, Bob Proctor, Jim Rohn, Tony Robbins. And I really didn't know why they were talking about goal setting in a life insurance training, but I liked what I heard. So I continued to listen. And when I set my own goals, I talked to the owner of the life insurance company and asked him, "Hey, how can I grow more?" And he encouraged me to read Think and Grow Rich. So I bought a copy of the book. Meanwhile, the car dealership that I worked for called me back and invited me back to work. So I wasn't really sure if I wanted to go back, but I decided to go back to selling cars. And I was reading Think and Grow Rich at the time. I had just started to read the book and get into it. And so as I started to apply the principles, the 13 steps to riches in Think and Grow Rich, my income pretty much quadrupled from applying the principles. So you'll read that in the introduction of the book as well too. So that's how I got interested in him. And the second part of that is once I started to kind of look up Napoleon Hill's biography, I saw all of this information, this misinformation, that he was a fraud, that he was a scammer, that he never knew Andrew Carnegie, he never knew President Roosevelt, he never knew President Wilson, he never knew Thomas Edison or Henry Ford or anybody that he claims he interviewed to compile his philosophy of individual achievement. So I went on the hunt to find the original sources of newspaper articles or reports during the time that he lived to see what they had to say about the matter.
Wow. So you couldn't escape it. Tried to read the book, put it aside, and end up coming back to it. Not only coming back to it, but writing 4 volumes about the author of that book and his life. And so how when you first got involved, because I know a lot of people have probably the same kind of questions, is it true? Is it not true? That sort of thing. I would argue I don't care. Because if you applied the principles written about in his book and quadrupled your income, that to me is evidence that what he wrote, wherever he got it from, made sense and when applied could transfer someone's life. So if everything else was BS, I don't care.
Right. I totally concur. My only suspicion was that it wouldn't let me rest. Was I went to tell a personal fellow of mine, and this is really where it started. I told a personal friend of mine about Think and Grow Rich, and I said, "Yeah, look up the book, order the book, and maybe we can talk about it." I was trying to start my own mastermind, and his reply was, "Hey, I'm not so sure I want to read it because I saw this article online in this YouTube video that said he was a fraud." So I began to see that it was deterring people from learning about the philosophy of individual achievement, or learning about the power of manifestation, or using your mind, because they thought that this person was, a crackpot. So I really wanted to learn for myself, because I don't want to, purport or endorse somebody. Even if the principles work, I don't want to endorse it unless I know that I can actually effectively say, hey, that is misinformation, and debunk, a lot of that false narrative.
I'm with you on that point. I'm just saying that for me, it wouldn't make any difference. But that said, I do really emphasize. Excuse my dog. I really do emphasize the idea of, walking the talk, and presenting a transparent and honest representation of who you are, if you're going to provide this kind of information to the public, whether that's through a book, an audio program, a seminar, a workshop, whatever it might be. I think it's true that you should walk your talk and be a person of integrity, impeccable if possible. And so, yeah. How difficult was it for you to start that search and find the kind of information that led you to whatever conclusion we'll get to? I don't want to, but so tell me more. How easy was it to search this stuff for Napoleon Hill?
At first, it was very, very difficult. I was very lost. I was in the dark and didn't know where to start. So the first thought I had was to look up newspaper articles from that time frame and just search his name. So I subscribed to newspapers.com, which is a collection of newspaper articles from since newspapers were a thing. And I just searched, Napoleon Hill, Oliver Hill. And, in the olden days, in the 1900s, they went by their first initial of their first name and the initial of their middle name and their last name. So he's in a lot of articles, it was just O.N. Hill for Oliver Napoleon Hill. And, found a bit of articles, but still couldn't find, how he knew Andrew Carnegie, how he knew President Roosevelt, and how he knew President Wilson. So I continued to dig. And, honestly speaking, this may sound strange, but I felt, led and guided to be able to find the information. So I found the right information for, one, a lot of the false claims that said he was a fraud because some of his businesses failed. And then also the narrative that he didn't know some of these benefactors that contributed to his philosophy.
An interesting point, because, when I had heard, and I'd been reading Napoleon since I was a kid. And
wow.
Since I was 6 years old, I had my mom start reading it to me when I was 6, and then I started reading my own, like at 11. But I've read it all of my life, that book and many others. But I've always had my hands on Think and Grow Rich almost daily, with the exception of about a year and a half of my life.
Mm-hmm.
But that's just who I am. I just said I want to make a study of this, and it to read it on a daily basis, whatever you read, if it's something that is going to benefit you, I think the more you fill yourself with it, the deeper it speaks to you, the greater the root stakeholder, the more you begin to understand the nuance of it. Anyway, so yeah, when I heard, well, maybe none of this is true, or it was bogus, or when I realized also that there were other people, that predated him, who had many of these same ideas, and they went, well, okay, what if he did fabricate it? What if none of it was true?
Mm-hmm.
And I get that. I was a little, but when I discovered the ups and downs in his life, like, people, you'll pass me at the starting gate kind of thing, And he didn't. People say, well, he didn't have the wealth of Andrew Carnegie. He made money, lost money, made money, lost money, that kind of thing. He had hardship.
Mm-hmm.
As somebody who's embraced the philosophy, I go, he demonstrated the philosophy by being persistent and by doing whatever legally he had to do in order to continue to prosper and to make a living, whether everything worked out for him or not.
Right.
Because there's this tendency to think, well, if you apply the principles, then it's like the heavens gates open up and everything just becomes rosy and there's never any challenge or anything like that ever again in your life. And, you're just walking down this incredible path. And for Hill, it wasn't quite that simple or that easy. And it isn't for most of us.
Right.
So to me, I looked at it later, as an adult. Maybe I wouldn't have as a child, but as an adult, here's a guy who had to apply the principles in order to see himself through in life and to apply them however he did. So I became more of a hero to me having hardship and going through all of the hardships than I guess he would have if everything was rosy.
Right, exactly. And that's really the real story of the Gospel of Napoleon Hill. While the surface of the context and content is, debunking a lot of misinformation, it's really his biography and how he struggled and how, he came to write Think and Grow Rich and even the Law of Success. So, I mean, from getting that idea in 1908 until, 1928, when he first published the Law of Success, he started to compile that in 1924. So even from 1908 to 1924, he had all these, separate documents. And it was really a tragedy because when he went to Chicago, he was living in Ohio at the time. He lived in Cleveland. And then he went to Chicago to try to retrieve a lot of his memorabilia, letters from Andrew Carnegie and, presidents that he knew. And the warehouse where he was keeping it actually burned to the ground. So he was devastated. And prior to that, like right before that, months before that happened, somebody who was another newspaper or magazine editor at the time who was calling him a fraud actually bought Napoleon Hill magazine and then closed it down. So essentially he lost his magazine, the main form of him, teaching his philosophy. And some guy named Bob Hicks bought the magazine. And when Napoleon Hill couldn't pay the lump sum for the cost of printing, he shut the publication down. So those things happened back to back. And it was during that time that, he was, using the principles that he taught. And it came to mind that he should go ahead and compile all of the information that he had. And that's when he started to compile The Law of Success, his first book that was published in 1928. And it came out and it first sold very well to the point where he bought a Rolls Royce and he also bought a estate in Upper New York in Saugerties, New York. And it was called Sugar Bark or Shark Bark or something along those lines, where this estate was a huge estate. And then the stock market crash of 1929 happened. So the sales of the book actually came to a crawl. And now he was pretty much in poverty again. So he had to start all over again. In 1930. So it took him from 1908 until 1935 to actually find success for his life's mission. So he got this mission when he was 25 years old, and he was in his late, early 50s before he was able to even see the fruition of that. So when he talks about persistence as one of his, principles, he really lived it. And so really, this story, if you want to learn a story about persistence, if you have a dream or a vision for your life, or, if you're trying to manifest something, Napoleon Hill's story and the background information that's not prevalent today will really encourage you, because he hung in there until 1935, and it came from an unlikely source. It was a woman who he didn't stay married to long at all, but Rosalie Beelan was his wife at the time. She ended up actually cheating on him with somebody else, and they had a tumultuous marriage and a tumultuous divorce. But she was the one at the time, because the universe just happened to bring her into his life at the time to say, hey, put out, what was called at the time 13 Steps to Riches. So he changed the name to Think and Grow Rich, published it, and then that was when his dream became a reality.
Well, see, again, it's all of that makes me admire him even more, because when you talk about, you're never too old or you're never too young to succeed, Sometimes they don't say, well, what if it takes you 60 years to do it, or 40 years to do it? Are you willing to do it? And he was, and he pursued it, kind of like the Wright brothers. They were like, we're going to fly, and they kept experimenting until they flew, but they didn't know how to fly until after they flew.
Right.
But once they flew, they could improve on it. And same thing kind of like with Hill. He had his ups and downs, but through it all, he was able to apply those principles and to make it work. So let's go to, and here's another thing, and this is personal. I've lost almost everything in floods, not fire, but in floods. I've had multiple floods. And I live in Hollywood, and I also live in the Midwest. But when I was a young person in Hollywood, I never took a single photograph. So there are photographs of me at parties or with people, but none that I ever took of me or, people or parties or anything like that. I just didn't carry a camera, didn't think to do it. Thought it's all here. I don't need this. So now as an older person with children, I go, I don't have any photographic evidence or any proof of anything because it's either been destroyed in water damage and floods, or I just didn't do it. So I get, how it doesn't devastate me that I don't have this stuff. I mean, it's like, it doesn't matter, but I do get how when he went to retrieve his prized possessions and they're burned up, that it becomes hard to prove what you say you have done. So let's go back to Carnegie and a little bit and explore that.
Absolutely.
And how he got the invite and if the story's true or not true, and the stopwatch, and let's kind of unpack that for people.
Absolutely. Well, I found that it was absolutely true. I wasn't sure at first. So Napoleon Hill's first job out of college, he went to a college called Tazewell College in Tazewell, Virginia, and he graduated in 1901 when he was 18 years old. So he graduates college when he's 18, and he wanted to work for a guy named Rufus Ayres. So Rufus Ayres had moved into Wise County, Virginia, when Napoleon Hill was about 11 years old. And since that time, he wanted to, work for Rufus Ayres. So that was his dream. And so he went to business college because of Rufus Ayres, because Rufus Ayres was a lawyer. He was actually the Attorney General for the state of Virginia at one point. He owned several banks and several coal mines, and he was a multimillionaire in that time in the early or late 1800s. So Napoleon Hill really wanted to work for him. So when he graduated from Tazewell College, he writes him a letter and says, hey, I want to come work for you. However, I know that, you have no vested interest in hiring me, so I will pay you for the privilege of working for you. Only if I do a good job, then you'll pay me what I paid you. And so that's how he got his first job. And so Rufus Ayres, while he was working for him, he worked for him from 1902 to about 1904. It was, his introduction to a guy named Robert Taylor. So Robert Taylor was the governor of Tennessee, and it was Rufus Ayres who introduced him to Robert Taylor. And Robert Taylor at that time was just now producing a magazine called Bob Taylor's Magazine. And that came out in April of 1905. And then in 1907, they changed the name to Taylor Trotwood Magazine. There's actually an article that Napoleon Hill wrote. You can find it. It's public record. It was just called Mobile, Alabama. It's about his time in Mobile, Alabama when he lived there in 1907 and 1908 in Taylor Trotwood Magazine. But essentially, Robert Taylor hired him to be a reporter for the magazine and actually commissioned him to write success stories. And the first person that he commissioned him to interview for the success story was Andrew Carnegie. So it was Robert Taylor who introduced him to Andrew Carnegie and had him, go to his offices in Pittsburgh and then later on his home in New York and interview him. And what was supposed to be a 3-hour interview turned into a 3-day interview. And at the end of that interview, for 3 days, Andrew Carnegie commissioned him to spend 20 years interviewing his friends who were wealthy. He would introduce them with letters of introduction. And, he was going to have to pay his own way, though. He was just like, I'll front the costs for introductions and things, but you would have to pay your own way. And that's one of the reasons why he had so many careers, is because he never meant to actually start a career and stay there. He just wanted to earn a little bit of money, move a little bit towards his goal of compiling the philosophy, and go on like that. So Robert Taylor was the one that introduced him to Andrew Carnegie. And what I found was several articles of Robert Taylor and Andrew Carnegie knowing each other. So that was the link. And so I couldn't find that out at first. I was very perplexed. I knew that Robert Taylor introduced him to him, but I had no proof of that. And I believe it was 1909, there is a banquet where Andrew Carnegie is hosting for his group called the Optimist Club. And Robert Taylor is the keynote speaker. And so they knew each other. So the fact that his boss knew Andrew Carnegie is evidence that, he definitely had an introduction to him.
Yeah. So now, would you have accepted Carnegie's proposal? I don't know that I would have. If I were 19, 20, 25, and somebody said, hey, you work for me for 20 years, but I'm not going to pay you anything, but I'll give you entree to all these really rich people, but you're going to have to pay your way. Would you do it? And I don't know that I would have done that. So it's and or have decided within a very short time frame.
Right. No, I wouldn't have done it. That doesn't sound like a very good deal to me. And I don't think Napoleon wanted to do it. Whenever you read his or hear him in his lectures talk about that moment, he says something inside of him rose up in him and forced him to say yes. So it was almost kind of like a calling. And there's a difference between making a logical decision and something in an unction, forcing you and prompting you to do something that you're calling. So I really believe that it was his calling to compile this information. And I think there was a spiritual force behind him as well, too. So it wasn't just a logical decision, because logic had nothing to do with it. If logic had anything to do with it, he would have declined it. I think he felt led to do it.
I think that is such a great point, and one that, wow, I don't know if anyone's ever said that but you. That pointed out the fact that he did say that, that something did rise up inside of him. That is fascinating. Let me sidestep Hill for a moment, and we'll come back. I want to talk about you, if you don't mind. You said, I'm working for a car dealership. I read this book, and then I quadruple my income. People are going to say, well, how do you do that? Because you hear these stories of people who go, I apply the principles, and suddenly, I made more money than I had been making, or I made more money in a short period of time than I had in a long period of time. What did you do differently? How did you transform yourself applying the principles so that you were able to unlock this flow of money?
Right. So let me start with saying this. I read The Secret in 2007 when it came out. And, not to take anything away from The Secret, but what I learned about manifestation and how I was applying The Secret was the missing link that Napoleon Hill talks about. So while they talk about manifestation in The Secret, Napoleon Hill talks about the power of autosuggestion. Yeah. And he even says in Think and Grow Rich, the chapter on autosuggestion is what this book is all about. And all the other 12 or 13 chapters is really a way for you to apply autosuggestion. Yep. So when I learned about autosuggestion and planting an idea in your subconscious mind, that changed everything. So I began to write down, just like he does in chapter 2. He coaches you on how to write down your statement of affirmation as far as what you want to bring into reality. So I wrote it out in full detail of I wanted to make $100,000 a year selling cars. And I wrote it out just the way he says it in chapter 2 and begin to repeat it when I wake up in the morning and repeat it right before I go to bed. I took it a step further because if you read the chapter on autosuggestion, it says it's self-administered stimuli through your 5 senses. So once I picked up on the key being the 5 senses, I began to surround myself with things that allowed me to see $100,000, hear it, taste it, feel it, and smell it. And what I did was I bought some prop cash from Amazon, and I just filled my bedtime drawer with it. So I have a drawer next to my bed. It's just filled with fake money. There's probably like $150,000 in there. So first thing I do when I wake up, I look at that and I feel it in my hands. And I count it as well, too. So I'm able to see money and touch it at the same times. And then I bought some mints. They're wrapped in $100 bills, but my breath mints, I don't use like, Altoids or Lifesavers or anything like that. I use these mints that are wrapped in $100 bills. And those are my mints that I use throughout the day while I'm selling cars. And that allows me to taste money, if you will. And then I also bought some essential oil from a place. And the essential oil smells like money. It has the scent of money. So I spray that on my hands. And in the morning, I kind of take a deep breath of it and smell that essential oil of the smell of money. And then also I recorded myself saying my affirmation. So I'd read the whole thing out. And at work, I'd have one earbud in. I'd listen to it over and over again on my way to work. It's a 12 to 13 minute drive to work. I would play that. I stopped listening to music for probably 2 years. My friends would be like, hey, have you heard this new album? Have you heard this new record? And I was just like, I'm not listening to music. What I was listening to was my affirmations on the way to work. I put headphones in at night while I was sleeping. I listened to it while I was sleeping at night. And I just reiterated into my subconscious mind that I was going to make $100,000. So I'll tell you the end result of that. My first year selling cars, and I'll just, not to brag about income or anything like that. It's just for the purposes of knowing, how this had an effect on my life. My first year selling cars, I made $60,000, and my goal was $100,000 from the start. So I knew I was quite a bit of ways away. And then, so there was 2 years of making $60,000. And then the third year I sold cars, I made 86. And then sure enough, the next year I made 86 again. So there's 2 years of 60, 2 years of 86. And once I made 86, that's when I got Think and Grow Rich. And I knew I was close. I was only $14,000 away. So the start of 2021, January, I made about $4,200. So I was going in the wrong direction. So I was saying my affirmations. I'm doing all these, things to plant in my subconscious mind, visualizing it, feeling as if it was already done. And the month, 6 months in, I make $5,000 or $4,200. And one thing that Napoleon Hill talks about is persistence. I mentioned that earlier. So I doubled down on my affirmations. And by June 30th, halfway through the year, I had already met my goal. I was already at 100,000 June 30th. So it was really a miraculous experience. Not only did I finish the year at over $200,000, other things begin to happen. So we owed money, some back taxes. You'll read about this in the book, but we had owed some back taxes. From my income increasing, we were able to pay that all off. One day I logged into my student loans account. I had about $40,000 in student loans. They were all forgiven. So it's just so many things happened between 21 and 22 that were financial blessings in my life, because you really don't get what you pray for, even if you're a believer. One of the key things I learned is you don't get what you pray for. You get what is in your subconscious mind. So I began to use that as my form of prayer, so that I would actually create it for myself through the power of, my mind and my power to create my own reality.
Well, I love this because, so many people read books, or they listen to audios, or they go to workshops or whatever, but they don't do what they're told to do. I mean, even the chapter on auto-suggestion says read it every day for 30 days. And people don't do that. They don't, go back and do this and go to this chapter and do that and then come back and do. He tells you how to study the material, and most people just never do that. Mm-hmm. And yet you did. And what I appreciate too, in terms of everything, was the idea that you should have a drawer full of cash. I love that. The scent of money. We're going to have to find out where you buy the scent of money, because that sounds good. Or mints with, wrapped in $100 bills. Those are all awesome assets to use to do exactly what you did. Right. But also the fact that you said, first month in, I made, $4,200, and I made $5. I'm like way away from my goal. But you didn't give up, which what a lot of people do. A lot of people have this conversation. Napoleon Hill says, put a deadline date on your thing. And there are all these people who say, well, don't do that, because then as you get close, you'll get worried, you'll get nervous, you get frightened. You become you notice how far you are from your goal. And so you might give up. And I go, but that's the point of having the deadline, is to get through all of those difficulties.
Right.
Because you don't have to have it at the deadline. It would be nice if that happens. But the point is it's there for you to double down, like what you did. You said, well, and I just played it harder. I did it more. I did, I got involved, as opposed to I backed out and went, well, this is stupid. And those people who, like Hill would say, You know, as long as you keep going, you can win. But if you throw in the towel, it's over. And you demonstrate that you kept going.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was very key for me to read about persistence, the chapter that in Think and Grow Rich called Persistence, because that's really what kept me going. In addition to learning some of the biographical details of Napoleon Hill's life and how he just repeatedly had the winds knocked out of his sails in trying to get, this philosophy out, whether it was called Law of Success, Think and Grow Rich, The Magic Ladder to Success. So all of his books have all of his 17 principles in it. And he tried to get this thing off of the ground over a period of 29, 30 years. And just imagine of having a vision for your life. And after 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, everything you have in your hands, excuse my language, turns to shit. And you just can't make it work. And how tempted you would be to give up. And that's what I really admire about him as well, too, and about his life. So that's the other reason why I was so motivated to find out, the details of this misinformation that's out there about his life, because I don't want people to be deterred from, reading about his principles and being able to see these results in their own life.
Well, and you have results to prop you up. I mean, in other words, you've done it. Let me ask you another question regarding that, though, because I know people want to know. And that is, as it began to change, you went from not having the money to June 30th, and then ultimately doubling what you had wanted to make. How did it change for you? I mean, in other words, you're listening to this stuff. Are you then a more aggressive salesperson? Is it about, the story of R.U. Darby, and, he'd never take no for, as an answer because, he had learned the hard way. What kind of thing changed so that your income changed? You're listening to this stuff. Was it something you did, something you said, how can you explain how you went from 86 to over 100 to 200,
Yeah, absolutely. When you read Think and Grow Rich, the very first preface says that the secret is in the book and it comes in two parts. It took me reading the book 3 or 4 times to learn what the secret was. But it's definite of purpose and definiteness of plans. And that was the other part, was I had to put a plan in place. So when not only was I saying affirmations every day, my plan was to schedule an appointment every day. So I had worked there for about 3 years. So I had customers that had already bought cars from me. So the only thing I did when I came in and just had a goal to set an appointment. So I would call them and just say, hey, you've had your car for 2 or 3 years now. Would you like the new version of that? Would you like, the 2021 or the 2022? And, out of nowhere, people just began to respond yes. And it was another miraculous experience, to the point where not only were they saying yes, just like that, they were hounding me. I would get phone calls constantly. Hey, can I come and get a new car? Sometimes I'd be in the dealership and I'd bump into somebody and that would just turn into a car deal. One day I called one of my previous customers. This was probably the best day I ever had in car sales, in the middle of this explosion of, manifesting my goal to earn over $100,000 selling cars. But I called one of my previous customers and he was just like, yeah, I'll come in and we'll look at a new car, but my wife wants one too. So sure enough, he brings him and his wife. And then while I'm waiting for them to arrive for their appointment, the lady is walking in the showroom. And I say, ma'am, may I help you? And she says, no, I'm just waiting for my sister and my brother-in-law to come. I said, are you waiting for Adam and Tracy? And she says, yeah, that's my sister and my brother-in-law. They're coming to get a new car. I want a car too. So I was just like, yeah, we can actually look at that as well too. So now there's 3 people interested. Not only that, that sister had a twin sister. So Tracy, my friend's wife, had 2 twin sisters. And so one didn't want to do one without the other. And so then the twin sister comes, and then the sister's mom actually came and got a car. So it was just one of those things where I'm saying my affirmations and everything like that. And that first month, I went in the opposite direction, but there came a time where it just really just started to flow and it really started to work. And that was just one of the, many things that happened, when it really started to work for me is, my goal started to just happen out of nowhere and fall into my lap, because when it started to come, it came in droves.
Well, and as he says, when it comes so quick as to make you wonder where it's been all along, or it might even frighten you. But it's also what you demonstrate too is his point about your broadcasting and receiving station. And once you begin broadcasting or vibrating at that frequency, once you called money and money responds, then the floodgates do tend to open up. Doesn't mean there isn't going to be hardship or other things, but it does, there is this movement. And I think that it also means, it heals life itself. Once you get used to creating and making things happen, it's like this, multimillionaires who go, I'm not worried if I lose my money because I just make it over again. They learned how to do it. They learned the knack of it, and they since they've had the experience of having done it, it's kind of like a no-brainer to do it again.
Mm-hmm.
What I also really appreciate is, my favorite character in the whole thing was Barnes, because Barnes shows up to Edison, dressed as a hobo, the whole bum story.
Mm-hmm.
And then the paragraph in the book that says, for many months, in some books, depending on which one you read, is for 5 years, nothing happened, nothing. There was no outward evidence that he would ever be Edison's partner, but he kept the dream alive inside him until that moment when an opportunity came about, and he comes in through the back door. It's never what you expect it to be, and the rest is history. He became Edison's partner. But it's that in the face of no evidence, maintaining, persisting in keeping that vibe going, keeping that mindset going, keeping the auto-suggestion and the subconscious. Because otherwise, what's happening is you go, yes, I'm there. No, I'm not. Yes, I'm there. No, I'm not. And you get nowhere.
Right. So, and I just want to point this out to your audience.
Please.
The title of the book is not Think and Get Rich.
Right.
The title of the book is Think and Grow Rich. And after reading that book several times, I realized that he's likening the subconscious mind to a garden, and that thought, your desire, as a seed. And when you say in the face of nothing happening, that's what happens when you grow something. Above surface, you don't see anything. It's cultivating underground. It's getting nutrients, it's getting water, it's getting sunlight, but that's the life of a farmer. The life of a farmer, when you plant a seed, is you have to wait a long time to reap your harvest, but you still have to keep nurturing the seed. And that's why it's called Think and Grow Rich. It's not about growth or maturity as a person. It's about the idea, the thought, and the desire and the vision that you have growing, because that's typical of a seed. When you plant it, you're not going to see anything happen for a while. And you just have to keep giving it the nutrients that it needs.
I love it. I really, that is such a valuable point that you make for all of us. I've been teaching seminars for 50 years. And the thing about it is that during this process, there used to be medically, neuroscience wise, the experts would say, like those who said you cannot fly, the brain is like a jar. And that once the jar is full, all you can do is slough it off. You're just going to lose brain cells. And that analogy, that metaphor was changed or transformed somewhere around the 80s and 90s to the brain's more like a garden. It's or like a jungle where there's teeming with life and vibrance. And depending on how you nurture it and what you do to give it nutrition, it can grow however you want. And what you just said is really true, because so many people think it is think and get rich.
Right.
It's supposed to happen tomorrow. Right. And then we hear these stories about the Chinese bamboo that goes for 5 or 7 years underneath the ground with no visible evidence that anything's going to happen to it. When people first hear that, you go, who would water ground for 7 years not knowing it was going to be there? I mean, how long did it take people to figure out that this seed, when planted, takes half a decade to grow underground? And yet the idea is that what you just said is so powerful. It's growing. Then you just have to keep it growing, and then you can grow your wealth. I love that. I just truly love that.
Absolutely. I'd like to share some of the so-called scams and frauds from the book the results of those. That way it's kind of a carrot on a stick to draw them to the book. So one of the biggest claims is that when he lived in Alabama. So when he left Virginia in 1905 and moved to Alabama, I really don't know why he moved to Alabama. It was just kind of a sudden thing. I don't know if it was related to Robert Taylor. That's my suspicion, is that Robert Taylor, because he had started a magazine and had just been introduced to him, maybe he assigned him to go to Alabama. And the article in Bob Taylor's magazine is called Mobile, Alabama, but he moves from Virginia to Alabama and he becomes the sales manager of a lumber company. So when he was working for Rufus Ayers, he was the sales manager of a coal mine. So now he's the sales manager of a lumber company. And then his boss for the lumber company starts a lumber company and then brings Hill in as a partner. And so this company it's called Acree Hill. So the partner he had, his name was Jesse Acree and Napoleon Hill. So the name of the company was Acree Hill. And they started that in 1907 in Mobile, Alabama. So if you're a history buff like I am, you know about the Panic of 1907. So it's almost kind of like the pandemic, or it's almost kind of like the stock market crash of 1929. But the Panic of 1907 just really obliterated a lot of different businesses, and lumber being one of them. And Napoleon Hill talks about this in his lecture, the End of the Rainbow. And so it brought lumber sales to a crawl. So lumber was, scarce. The prices rose, and the sales went to a crawl. So Napoleon sold it to a guy named Jesse Shreve. Now, that gap of time between him selling it to Jesse Shreve, nobody ever talks about that. So if you have ever heard a YouTube video or seen an article where they talk about Napoleon doing this, it was actually Jesse Shreve that did this. So he sold lumber to people. What he would do is he would go to a wholesale lumber company and say, "Hey, let me borrow the lumber."
Shreve would do it.
Yes, Shreve would do it. But the company was still in Napoleon Hill's name. So he never changed the documentation of ownership. He did it in Napoleon Hill's name, but he was the one that was doing this. And it was a report that came out later that kind of outed him as the person that was doing this. And so he would go to wholesale lumber companies, borrow the lumber. He wouldn't pay them. He would borrow it, say, "Hey, I'm going to sell this. And then once I sell it, I'm going to give you your money back." So that's consignment. Whenever you borrow something, and then you can pay the person that let you borrow it later. Only what he would do is when he would sell it for a cheap price and never paid the wholesale lumber companies. So he did that to several lumber companies in several different states. And ironically enough, he got found out in Ohio. So he tried to come to Cincinnati in 1908, and he tried to sell lumber to a company up here. And the company realized that the letterhead was signed Napoleon Hill. You're Jesse Shreve, you're giving me letterhead, making a pitch to sell me lumber, but it's signed Napoleon Hill. So he reported it, and the authorities actually arrested the Shreves a couple of years later. They arrested them in like 1911, and they were convicted of a crime called using the mails to defraud. That was a big crime in those times. And using the mails to defraud is essentially using the mails, writing a letter or sending some type of proposal out, some type of flyer out, and then a person responding to that, and then you deceiving them and, taking their money in some type of scheme. So it was Jesse Shreve and his brothers who were the new owners of Acree Hill, but they never changed the name of the company. It was still called Acree Hill, and they never changed the ownership. So that's probably one of the biggest frauds. And then another one, and I can talk more about this if you want to, is that Napoleon Hill was an occult. So that's probably the two biggest ones that have kind of like the strongest implications and the strongest, condemnations of Napoleon Hill. That he was in this cult in the 1930s. And I did a little bit more research on that too. So, which turned out to not be true.
Well, that's cool. I mean, is there any more about that you want to say regarding what's alleged?
Yeah, absolutely. So, essentially, there was a cult that was started in 1929. It was called the Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, or the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians. And at the time, when he became affiliated with them, he was married to Rosalie Beeland. I mentioned her earlier. She was the one that actually encouraged him to go ahead and publish Think and Grow Rich. So there in 1940, they met in 1935. And in 1940, their marriage just, went for the worst. And so they bought a house together in Mount Dora, Florida. in December of 1938. And by, I want to say by April of 1940, they had sold the house. So not even a year and a half in, they sold the house and went their separate ways. She moved to New York, or started to, frequent New York, and he moved to Atlanta. The only problem is that when she initially got involved with this cult, she brought him around to tout him as, hey, I'm married to Napoleon Hill. So she would bring him to, some of the meetings there. But essentially, she was the one that had joined the cult, the Royal Fraternity of Master Metaphysicians, and he had nothing to do with it. When you read the articles of Rosalie Beelan being involved with this cult, it only mentions her name. If you would think a famous author at the time or a famous lecturer at the time, if he's involved, they're going to mention him. They only mention Rosalie Beelan. And in fact, when you look at the dates that are lined up with when she was involved, he lived in Atlanta. He had moved into Atlanta in 1940, and then from there moved to Clinton, South Carolina in 1941. So they went their separate ways, and then the divorce was final in March of 1941.
Well, it also appears that he wasn't really a homebody.
Right.
Busy traveling and all around the world, doing his seminars, lectures, and everything else. So, it makes sense that, he married more than once. Also, it didn't sound like he was always too much of a hands-on business person. He kind of got himself into situations that maybe somebody else wouldn't have, had the difficulty that he did, but it was because he was busy doing something else. In other words, I think it was he was doing his calling, and some of the other details just kind of fell by the wayside. Would you say that's kind of an accurate or
absolutely
possible? Okay,
absolutely.
So it does, but it demonstrates also that flawed though we might be, doesn't mean we can't put these principles into practice and have some pretty incredible results.
Right. Yeah. Incredible results indeed. And, if, you wanted to get the book here and it doesn't come in 4 volumes, I encourage you to just take 1 volume at a time. So if you just read 1 volume and then the details of it at the end, you want to go on with the story, that would, probably, eating it, biting it off in little bits at a time is probably the best way to go about reading the book. But hey, if you're a person that likes biographies, then get all 4 volumes. But I realize not everybody likes biographies. I'm just a history buff, and I like to read autobiographies and biographies of other people throughout history. And so, this genre, specifically appeals to me. But if you, have been positively impacted by Napoleon Hill or Think and Grow Rich, even just the details of his life will further embolden and further encourage the principles that have worked for you.
Well, I like, personally, I like that not everything was perfect and that he wasn't necessarily perfect, that he had, whatever issues that he had, because it means that it's hopeful for everybody else. If he could walk on water and no one else can, then, it becomes a problem.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, he wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. He was just a vessel, just like anybody else. And he never purported, to be anything that he wasn't. And that's one of the things I admire about him as well, too. I mean, he lets you know, even in some of his lectures, if, some of his lectures are on YouTube from like the 1950s and 1960s, right, where he will say, a lot of people try to discourage me from telling the details of my life because I had so much, negative things. I was married 4 or 5 times. My businesses went to crap, and all the negative things. But he says that's all the more reason why I know this stuff works and why I encourage you to apply these principles, is because in spite of all of that, I still was able to, experience my vision and my dream for my life.
And that to me, I read Laws of Success, and arguably there are 2 versions, that like an early version and a later version.
Yeah, 1925, 1928.
And people debate those, why and all that. But and I love Laws of Success. I like all of his works, but Laws of Success is like a meteor version, of Think and Grow Rich. But at Think and Grow Rich, he managed to kind of encapsulate it in a way that I found it easy to get into. You said you had a trouble reading it. I found that with Laws of Success, because for me it was a drier book. But but the point is that in both books, or as he wrote, he'd say, you know, there was this woman who did this, and she put together this in Laws of Success, put together, you know, the press packet for this person to get a job, right? Wrote the letter, I mean, you know, or there was this guy who had these strange nighttime meetings with all these other people. And then later he goes, well, yeah, that was me, or yes, that was my wife, or yes, that, you know, I mean, in other words, he kind of cloaks some of the biographical stuff up front and then later fesses up to it, which was interesting. You think any of that kind of like, same thing with Outwitting the Devil, where they went, you know, maybe this is a little bit too sketchy to put out now?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, and that's one of the reasons. I mean, he wrote Outwitting the Devil in 1938,
right?
And that wasn't published till after. And some of these ideas, as you can imagine, in the 20s and 30s, they were not popular ideas. I mean, you're talking about a very religious culture that were, you know, really, really tied to the Bible. And so when he's saying things, you know, outside of that, or adding to that, or some type of variation of that, that's not exactly, you know, a religious teaching, he caught a lot of criticism for a lot of these principles because they weren't popular. While New Thought is a popular idea now, but in the 20s and 30s, people were very, very traditional.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, I just lost my train of thought. Interestingly enough, it was one of those things about, when I read Outwitting the Devil when it first came out, you know, when they published it, you know, posthumously, I mean, I would agree, you know, in our, we always tend to think that where we are right now is the way everybody else was. So if we look at when Outwitting the Devil came out, and you go, wow, I mean, obviously this is, you know, an analogy, it's a metaphor. I mean, I don't know that, you know, he's actually thinks he's talking to the devil. He has disclaimers in it, you know, and kind of leaves it vague and the whole thing, you know, but I mean, I never got the sense that, you know, I would take that seriously, other than it's kind of a conversation with himself. But that was me then. But if I had read it in 1938, I might have had a very completely different experience, because I would be a product of 1938, not the product of the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, you know. And so how we understand a work oftentimes is different than it was maybe originally intended. And that said, the point that I was going to ask was, you know, there was Wallace Wattles, and there was Hennell, and there's, you know, all Elsie Benedict. I mean, there's all these other people who were either around his time or predates his time, and people say, well, he just took them and put this thing together. And again, I don't see anything wrong with that. You know, if he had done it and was deceptive about it, it'd be one thing. If he's plagiarizing, it'd be another. But my point is, you know, sometimes great ideas abound. You know, they're not solely the property of one person. So there's this New Thought era that's going on, and he happens to be in it, and he happens to connect with Carnegie, and Carnegie says, here, you know, I'm going to introduce you to all these people. And so at that time, you know, he's also reading other people who are saying somewhat similar things. What do you think about all of that time frame that he was in, and how his work came? And why does Think and Grow Rich so much more successful than, say, I mean, is it just the title, or is it so much more successful than, say, Wallace Wattles or any of the other books that say similar things but don't seem to pack the punch that his books did?
Yeah, I think, I mean, if I had to guess, I mean, even you know, similar authors during that time, I really think Napoleon Hill, you know, had a mandate on his life to complete this. It wasn't just, hey, I believe these ideas and I'm just going to write a book. So it wasn't really just a black and white, you know, dry, hey, I you know, these are my beliefs, so I'm just going to write a book about it. I mean, he really, it really consumed his whole life, you know, from the time that he was 25 years old until the time he passed away when he was 87. I mean, this really consumed his whole life. So it was very big difference than just writing a book. I mean, it was his life's mission. So I think that's why, his was more successful, because it took more, it's like cooking a meal. If you microwave a meal, it might taste okay, but if you take a few hours to really make a meal in a home cooked meal, it's going to really taste something. So him spending 20 years and really living it and really having to experience these principles through challenges and through hardship really made it that much more powerful when he actually was able to publish the book.
Well, I also think we shouldn't gloss over Blair Hill. And chapter 2, and the idea that if you can conceive it and bring yourself to believe it, you can achieve it. Mm-hmm. To me, I get it. Okay, you have to be able to conceive it in order to even imagine it, in order to be able to you have to conceive of a reality before you can live in reality. But he then says, you have to be able to bring yourself to believe, or the mind has to bring yourself to believe it, and that's what autosuggestion, and that's what the whole purpose of putting that into action. And then if you bring yourself to believe it, where you're certain of it, it's a certainty, and then you can achieve it. And obviously he said, I never said will, because I don't know what you'll do with it, but you can achieve it. But Blair, the whole hearing thing about he refused to accept that his son was not going to hear, and there's no visible evidence that Blair could hear, or the machinery inside his head to be able to hear, and yet he worked, and believed that it was possible that this was going to come about. What say you on that? Because that seems to be a really significant or shaping, he even says his wife, thinks he's nuts. And, and that she laughed, and he found that, or whatever, that he laughed, I forget. But then, they were a little bit at odds about this, making sure that Blair could hear.
Yeah.
But your take, please.
Yeah, absolutely. So Blair was enrolled in West Virginia University in 1936. And so he had enrolled in 1931, but he was a senior in 1936. So he actually added that into Think and Grow Rich at the last minute before he published it. So when Blair actually found a device called the Acousticon that really worked for him, and after all these years, from him being born in 1912 all the way up to 1936, now he could hear. Now he found a device that can actually help him hear, and he had no holes in his skull to even be able to hear. So it was really a mystery. And so it was so powerful for Napoleon Hill to experience this that he put it in the book and made it chapter 2 at the very last minute. And what I'll say about that is that story is probably the most powerful story that I can think of from all of Napoleon Hill's books, because one of the key things he says about that experience is that he told Blair is that your deafness is not a handicap, it's an advantage. And what you said was very true. Autosuggestion is not just about manifesting. Autosuggestion is really the cure for doubt. And when you start to actually believe that something impossible is going to happen, as if it's, there's no stopping it whatsoever, that's what autosuggestion does. It raises your faith and it raises your belief that it's actually going to happen. And that's what causes it. That's the really magic of what causes your dream to come to a reality, is your belief, your ability to see it, your ability to taste it, your ability to, you can feel it so strongly that it infuses your 5 senses. And when he said that to Blair, is that, hey, whenever I'm in a situation to where it seems like a disadvantage, or it seems like a loss, or it seems like, I'm inferior to, I reverse it, in that, hey, even though it seems like this may be a loss for me or a subtraction, it's actually an addition, and so really convincing your mind that this is actually, going to be a benefit to me. That's one of the key things that really help out with manifesting your dreams as well.
Let's we're actually almost out of time, but if you got a few extra minutes, we'll go a little long. I want to ask you a follow-up question on this.
Sure.
One of my favorite quotes, obviously Ford said, if you think you can and you think you can't, you're correct. But later Hill wrote that he said that Ford said, I never let what I cannot do prevent me from doing what I can. And that's become one of my totally favorite quotes. But all of the stories, the little girl who wanted 50 cents for her mama, facing, a beating, a bad beating, but not letting that deter her. Are-You Darby caves, they give up, they sell the equipment, somebody else gets rich and he decides, well, I'm never going to let that happen.
Mm-hmm.
Barnes, story is, in spite of not ever appearing to be Edison's partner, he becomes Edison's partner. And then you hear Steve Jobs had a reality distortion, machine is what they called it. The idea that you don't let the circumstances define you, or as Napoleon would say, damn the circumstances, I make the circumstances. Bonaparte said that.
Mm-hmm.
But the point being is that some people take circumstances and go, well, if I don't pay attention to them and I'm ignoring them, then I'm in trouble. But it's not ignoring them in that sort of way. When Hill said to Blair, you have an advantage that others don't.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a disability; it's an advantage that others don't have. And had him and instilled that in him, or helped to instill that in him. The refusal to say this is, he could say this is impossible. He could try it for a while, could have given up, like we were talking earlier, but he didn't. He pursued it. And for Blair himself, even in whether Laws of Success or whatever, he writes about Blair getting the job. His mom writes the letters for him or whatever, puts together his press kit and stuff like that. But he doesn't tell you that it was Blair at the time, or at least. My point being, what do we do with circumstances? In other words, the idea of persisting and to move forward and to know that, everybody, like the Wright brothers, everybody's saying you're an idiot, stop, this is stupid, you're never going to do it. All the experts say you can't fly, but they persist anyway. They don't have to be belligerent in that. They could have been, but I'm just saying you don't have to be belligerent, but they don't let circumstances define them. That's so much of what Hill writes about in all of the stories. Even the founding of the United States, with at the point of death, they don't let the circumstances prevent them from doing what they can do in order to make happen what they want to make happen. And that's why I like Ford's quote so much. But what say you? This Hill seems to have this very, very positive position on you can do it. Don't think you can't because of what you see or hear or feel or taste or smell. Use those things like you did to make your dream come true, whether it's manifesting or just getting through an issue. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Well, one of the key things about, circumstances that are in opposition to, what you may see for your life is it's actually one of the key ingredients to manifestation. Hardship, challenge, it's about redefining it. If you just look at it in and of itself, yes, it's going to feel like a curse for you. But if you see that it's actually a part of the ingredient. So if a small seed has in it, an orchard, or a field full of oranges, the first thing that has to happen is it has to go on the ground. Even the Bible talks about this. A seed has to die in order for what's inside of it to come out of it.
Right.
So if you have a dream inside of you, or if you have a dream or a vision that you're planning in your subconscious mind, the first thing that's going to happen is this part of the ingredients. It's not going to be smooth sailing. It's the opposite's going to happen. You're going to go on the ground. It's going to feel like death. It's going to seem dark. And you just have to redefine it, because that's not the end of the story. In fact, it's just the beginning, and it's just one of the many ingredients to manifesting and actually seeing come to fruition that dream that you have. And I encourage people to read a book by Neil Donald Walsh. He was one of the commenters in The Secret. It's called Happier Than God. And he talks about a law called the law of opposites. It's whenever you go out to, have an intention towards something, a lot of times the opposite happens. And he explains why that is. And it's because the opposite happening, or the circumstances, any negative circumstances or challenging circumstances happening, is part of the ingredient to it actually coming to fruition. So you just have to redefine it.
It's actually part of thermodynamics and science. The law of opposites, cause and effect. That whenever it's the it causes the equal and opposite effect on things. So night and day, tall and thin, or tall and short, thin and fat, the opposite. Right. And I always say every battery has a negative, positive pull on it. It's just, how you define it. That's beautiful. That really is beautiful. I could spend hours, days, maybe weeks, months, even years listening to you and with the opportunity to talk and then maybe ask a question or two. But we're going to have to draw this to a close. But I want a firm commitment that you'll come back again and again.
You have my firm commitment. You should just invite me whenever you want.
All right, cool. Well, that's awesome. No, this has really been a fascinating time, and I encourage people to get the book, and not only to get the book, but to rewatch this and really listen to what you've been saying, because it's more than just the history of Napoleon Hill. It's putting the principles into practice, and you put them into practice, and you've had success in your life as a result. And so you're speaking from experience, and you're speaking from also the historical point of view. So I appreciate that, and I'm so glad that JB, mentioned you and to bring you, so that hey, I got you on my show. This is cool. I feel great. So thank you so much for your work. I'm kind of in awe, because it's 2025 and it's just the beginning of 2025, and you're talking about, well, when COVID happened, I decided I was going to, and so you really did your homework. I mean, you really worked to do your research and to put this out and to come out with 4 volumes. It's no small task.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
No. So I encourage everybody to get the books, get these books, go to Amazon, go to eBay, get the books, because you're going to want to read these books, and you're going to want to watch this show again and again, and we'll have you back. Well, thank you for being here. This is Jason Youngblood. I've had a fabulous time, and I'll talk to you in just a couple minutes, but thank you.
Thank you.
Well, everybody, I like I said, I could go on and on and on listening to Jason and with hopefully the idea of asking a question here or there, but wonderful, how absolutely amazing, and how delighted I am. And the books are great. You just got to get the book. And so also I have to tell you about what I've been doing. I'm very, very pleased with this. And I've been putting together a program called Create Your Best Life Using the Genius of Einstein and Tesla. And what it's about is people who have used their mind in very specific ways. There's also Napoleon Hill writes about Elmer Gates and other people. But it's a program designed to help you overcome any difficulty that you're facing, be able to better problem solve, tune into your own intuition, be more creative, and to put into actual practice, into use, that kind of genius for yourself, so that you can break free from your problems or limitations and move forward to create the kind of success that you want. And it's Einstein, right there, rexsikes.com/Einstein. Go check it out. Go look at it. It's different components. It's a go at your own pace. It's an online. There's video. There's manuals. There's support groups. There's all sorts of things around it. I'm not going to go into that now. But go. This is a powerful, positive, practical course that has methods, principles, and practices designed to help you unlock your genius, unleash your power, and live the kind of life you truly deserve to live. I'm Rex Sikes. I'm so glad that you're here. As I always say, if you consider something a problem, it's a problem. If you consider something a blessing, it is a blessing. So go ahead and celebrate everything. Until the next time, I'll see you here. I got another guest coming up the next show. Always, when I like and subscribe to the show, go hit the bell notification. I always forget to say this. If you like the show, leave comments, and you can ask questions in the comments even during the replay, and hopefully, we can get those answered for you. But subscribe, like, and share the show with others who you think will benefit. Put it out there. I remembered this time to say it, so please do subscribe if you like the show. I'll see you the next time. Bye for now.